I've had a complicated relationship with Final Fantasy XIV over the last year. It hasn't exactly been a smooth ride. After beating a Realm Reborn in November of the same year, I ultimately walked away from the game with a mostly positive impression. Although I struggled to be invested in the story or characters and found the game's pacing to suffer from many lulls, I was utterly enamored with the world setting, the atmosphere, the visual presentation, and the soundtrack, and those elements highly elevated a game that otherwise felt somewhat narratively hollow. It was a game with a lot of passion and effort put into it, but perhaps not enough development time to fully realize a lot of those ideas. The game stuck in my mind though, enough for me to finally write and edit a video essay, something I've been wanting to do for ages but never really had the right topic. If you ask any of my friends, I talk about Final Fantasy XIV a lot, whether it be explaining cool parts of the lore or gushing over certain elements. It's never far from my mind, and I think about it at least a little bit every day. The soundtracks for A Realm Reborn, Before Meteor, and Before the Fall regularly rotate in my music playlist, and I find myself doodling the characters in my college notebook. I even own both A Realm Reborn and 1.0's soundtracks on Blu-ray, which I highly recommend looking into. Despite this, it often comes as a bit of a shock to my friends when I say I don't really love the game. Sure, I love many aspects of the game, but it also has many flaws that I am less than enamored with. Lately, however, I've noticed that perception has been heavily challenged. Playing the A Realm Reborn patch quests has been like watching a rose slowly creep out of its bud. Sure, it's not quite fully bloomed yet, but while the flower was already reasonably beautiful, you can see something utterly gorgeous beginning to form. Silly allegories aside, I enjoyed those patch quests a lot and found them in many ways to improve upon the game in ways that were both meaningful and substantial. However, I felt they also had their own share of flaws too, some inherited and some new. So, why don't you take this journey with me back to Eorzea? We'll sit down at the Drowning Wench with a hot meal and a glass of warm wine, the sounds of the sea cradling our ears, and I'll tell you the tales of my patch experiences, till the sea swallows all. This video will cover the patch quests from patch 2.1 to 2.5, the main narrative content, a few of the side quests, and other additional observations I have made. As should be expected, this video contains heavy spoilers for the A Realm Reborn patch quests, so if you haven't already, I'd highly recommend playing them first. I promise I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. Likewise, as of writing this, I have not significantly dabbled in Heavensward, so I don't know of any future events that occur in that or any other expansion. With that being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. Recall my video on A Realm Reborn. Needless to say, I thought the game's writing was overall okay. What constitutes writing though? For those who saw my first video, you might remember that I broke writing down into 3 categories: scenario, characters, and world setting, and these elements can certainly stand out as individual qualities, but ideally should meld seamlessly into one another, at least from my perspective. Take Final Fantasy XV, for example. Many people I've spoken to connected to XV's characters heavily. They found the interactions between Noctis and his clan endearing and engaging, and wish for those characters to return in future media. On the other hand, many other people I've spoken to found XV's scenario to be entirely lacking, and the complaint I often hear is the lack of a satisfying conclusion, whatever that means in this case. I've never played XV, but it's seemingly the perfect example of what I mean here. Many people care about the game's character writing in spite of the scenario writing, and often find the two don't meld as well as they could. Naturally, this is subjective, but I felt similarly polarized about XIV's writing in different ways. I loved how expansive, fleshed out, and most importantly, integrated into the experience the world setting was. I found myself going out of my way to do side quests I'd find otherwise boring just to get additional dollops of lore. Eorzea felt like a real place populated with real people, and unlike, say, earlier versions of Destiny, where the world setting was relegated almost entirely to outside media, XIV weaves its lore into every aspect of the game, and this immersed me greatly. It was beyond impressive. What was less impressive, however, were the scenario and characters. The scenario I found very average, questionably paced, and consisted primarily of setup, build-up, and a plot twist I found less than impactful. The characters I found fun, but unimpactful and flat. However, with the patch quests, I felt somewhat of a paradigm shift occurring. I found I began to care about the story beyond my own effort. I was no longer simply following the narrative. I was enjoying the narrative. I was invested, interested, and curious. Rather than the world setting carrying the scenario on its back, the scenario added to the setting with a greater emphasis on the world's politics, class struggles, and outside interests. From the beginning, this is apparent, with the Scions of the Seventh Dawn needing to relocate from the Waking Sands to the more neutral Revenant's Toll, as staying in Vesper Bay would leave them at the mercy of Teleji Adeleji of the Ul'dah Syndicate, and other outside interests that threaten the Scions' pledge to neutrality. While inaction was a theme in the base game, in the patch quests, it's the core of the narrative, specifically inaction from those in power. At many points, the leaders of the great city-states are confronted with issues that might not be their immediate problems, but still affect them in the long run, such as the rise of more powerful versions of the base game's primals, and some new ones such as Leviathan and Good King Mogglmog, causing Alphinaud to feel as if he has to step in himself and create the grand Eorzean party of the Crystal Braves, in a misguided attempt to be more like his legendary grandfather, Louisoix. The city-state's reluctance to assist Ishgard when the heretics and the Dravanians marched on the steps of faith is perhaps the most telling. While the Dravanian hordes weren't exactly knocking on their own doors, the fall of Ishgard would lead to horrible consequences across the entirety of Eorzea, but none of them could see the forest through the trees. While it's understandable that they might still feel resentment due to Ishgard's lack of assistance during the fateful Battle of Cretin, in my eyes, that doesn't justify leaving many innocent civilians who had nothing to do with their government's actions to the clenched claws of the Dravanians. When the Warrior of Light and their compatriots hold the line, however, the other city-states bask in the glory afterwards as if they even had a slight hand in it. This is compounded further when the Scions are blamed for the murder of the Sultana. Despite the reasonable skepticism from the Alliance leaders, none step forward to fight for their names except for Rauban. This is all well and good, mind you, but what makes the scenario here far more investing than anything the base game offered is the nuance involved. While the Alliance leaders refusing to defend Ishgard from the Dravanians is undeniably selfish, you can at least understand why, as characters, they would feel that Ishgard isn't deserving of their assistance after receiving similar treatment at Carteneau. Wounds like that don't just heal, they are sewn poorly and without the proper care are infested with rot. Likewise, when the Scions are framed for regicide by Ilberd and the now traitorous Crystal Braves, one might see that the actions of the Alliance are out of cowardice, but you can understand that interfering in the legal proceedings of a sovereign state would be an entire mess unto itself that could potentially cause more problems, if not outright war. The only one who acted was Rauban, who stepped in out of unchecked rage purely to avenge the Sultana. As he fought, however, it became clear to him that more was happening behind the scenes, helping the Scions escape at the cost of losing his arm. By the end of the patch quests, he's found himself imprisoned and on trial for the murder of Teleji Adeleji. Decisions on such a large scale are never easy, and every action, or lack thereof, can have deep cutting consequences. This doesn't defend anything they've done. Leaving the Ishgardian citizens to the dragons is pettiness incarnate, and allowing the Scions, who have dragged them bloodied and battered out of numerous situations, to be thrown under the bus by false murder accusations showcases the true spinelessness of their characters and institutions. While Rauban letting the Scions go free was brave and compassionate, letting his rage get the best of him may have made the situation worse, if not for the Scions, then for himself. At the same time, fighting a legal battle against the Sultanate and the Monetarists would have been a 90-degree uphill battle, one that he was likely not to win, and not to mention, Teleji was planning on using ancient Allegan artifacts as an excuse to instill a dictatorship. At many points, I asked myself genuinely what I would have done in these situations, and I was never able to give myself a clear answer, because for scenarios like these, there simply is none, and that is the hallmark of an engaging and intelligent blend of scenario and character writing. In my opinion, the peak of the patch quest writing was the Doman refugee crisis, and the riots stoked by the monetarists amongst the refugees against the upper classes. Ul'dah is a civilization that values financial wealth above all else. Those who are rich are believed to have earned it, and those who are poor are believed to have not done enough. It stands to reason that your average Ul'dah citizen would feel little to no sympathy for refugees. Sure, there are still government plans to help them, but they are highly expensive and taxing on the government and its people. The average Ul'dah citizen sees the refugees refugees as leeches and treats them with hostility and disdain. If you are a citizen of Ul'dah, a civilization that values this wealth above literally all else, to the point where not only does it crush the refugees financially, but causes you, the middle-class worker, to teeter on the verge of dropping into a similar situation, you'd probably be inclined to show them nothing but your disgusting bestial rage. But if you were a refugee who has nowhere else to live but intense and murky caves on the outskirts of town, would that not feel cruel to you? Would you not feel ashamed that you have to subsist exclusively on government welfare, which is hardly substantial at all, knowing that most citizens view you as ungrateful for it? Would you not feel like you're being treated as a cockroach that the government begrudgingly quote-unquote takes care of, and seeing people like you in a similar situation seeking refuge from the fascist Garleans turned away for what? Political spaghetti code? Would that not spur you to protest the government? And seeing your people slain in front of you, why wouldn't you listen to the shady monetarist providing you with weapons to rise against the very government that's slain your kin? And the government, unable to find out who exactly is gaming your own broken system, who is paying off your subordinates and feeding off the violence, and the citizens seeing a violent refugee revolt happen, wouldn't that fuel your hatred towards them, your wish for them to be quelled? The game explores every facet of this conflict thoroughly, whether it be the fear of being displaced from your own class or the fear of being denied refuge, but the most important part is that the game doesn't pretend that these two sides are on equal footing either. One is undeniably more well off than the other, and the game knows that, and it knows that it can't be solved by shaking hands. It is surprisingly nuanced and clever with how insidious people can gain political sway with the right crisis. This is the first time the game made me actively angry, and in a way that benefits the narrative. It's highly investing stuff, and frankly, I smiled a little seeing Teleji being torn apart. While playing the patch quests, there was something that worried me, and that was the formation of the Crystal Braves. My first thoughts were a paramilitary organization run by an overconfident 16-year-old funded by money from questionable sources and consisting of people who potentially haven't been properly vetted. Don't tell me Square is gonna make this work out somehow. I hope you understand just how happy I was when things didn't. What initially seemed like an entirely implausible concept to me turned out to be just that, implausible. But it's not the writer's fault. In fact, it's Alphino's. While it's not like he hasn't seen hardship before, he does come from a place of privilege and a family with a storied history of heroism and glory. Attempting to follow in the footsteps of his grandfather Louis Soir, Alphino may be smart and skilled with diplomacy, but he lacks life experience, thinking if he simply talks big and walks tall, things will work out in the end. While I had previously criticized A Realm Reborn for a lack of character development and depth, Alphino's failure feels crucial not only for the direction of his character, but for the narrative direction of the series. So many pieces of media are afraid of allowing their characters to fail so drastically, so dramatically, with most failures being resolved with some love and elbow grease, but Alphino's actions have inadvertently branded the Scions murderers, potentially killed his friends, and forced them into exile. I suppose I shouldn't feel shocked. After all, this isn't exactly the most exceptional plot twist in the world and does feel slightly obvious looking back, but coming off of the base game, I feel these sort of cause-effect consequences are going to be key for the story moving forward. I'm beyond happy things turned out the way they did because it benefited the game greatly, even if it ended up turning out pretty poorly for the Scions. I'd also like to touch on the characters. Recall that while I found the characters in A Realm Reborn entertaining, I felt they were a bit stock and lacked nuance. This is another element that has been greatly improved as well. The Alliance leaders have been fleshed out greatly, as touched on before, but I'd like to touch on a few more characters, both new and old. Pre-existing characters, such as the Scions, for the most part, haven't changed a great deal. They're still not particularly deep, nor do all of them necessarily need to be, frankly, but the game does a better job of showcasing their individual traits. There's a bit in Revenant's Toll where Thancred's womanizing ways get the best of him, being confronted by a small horde of angry ladies, with one of them calling the other a Mikote man-stealer. It's a funny moment, seeing the consequences of his actions catch up with him, quite literally in this case, but it also reinforces his pre-existing character traits. Another good example of this is when the game fleshes out Totaru's position within the Scions by showing her insecurity as she tries out a number of combat-focused jobs, all ending in failure. character, before realizing that her friends appreciate her for who she is and never expected her to change. A character who currently remains a bit of a mystery to me is Y'shtola Rule, who often feels a bit impenetrable in terms of character. Now, I'm a bit unsure here. Perhaps she just wasn't considered as much of a priority by the writers, but if I had to make a guess, is that she's a highly intelligent person who, while versed in formalities, runs primarily off of social scripts, and when it comes to actually showing her emotions, she falters. Again, this is just a guess, and I have no way of knowing what comes next. Maybe I'm wrong, and she remains a bit of a board forever. We'll just have to wait and see. I also really appreciate the Crystal Tower quests, the entirety of which I'll speak on later, elaborating on the relationship between Sid Garland and Nero. Whereas the relationship felt a little hollow beforehand, now it genuinely does feel like there's history between the two characters, and not a remotely pleasant one. They bicker like an old married couple at points, and whatever wounds they may have are still clearly fresh and open, but you can tell to some extent they do care about one another. It was genuinely great to see. The patches also take care to introduce a few new characters. Firstly, Moonbrita was a bit of a delight. Sure, she basically just serves as a vehicle for lore exposition, showing the Scions how to use white auracite to capture Ascians, but her pleasing personality and her will they won't they dynamic with Yuri Angers made her immediately endearing to me. Watching the otherwise stoic character get flustered was always a laugh. Her death was also surprisingly tragic, but I loved its theme of facing death with purpose. The other one is Grahatia, who seems to have a very large fanbase online from what I can tell. I'm gonna be honest, at first I didn't care for him. It felt like he suffered from original the character syndrome, upending the rest of the plot temporarily to focus on his Allegan backstory and what exactly makes him so special. This isn't really the writer's fault. To my understanding, Crystal Tower was originally written as an entirely optional questline, made mandatory at a later date, so the problem stems more from being shoved into the main scenario rather than anything to do with Graha necessarily. I did end up finding him rather interesting though. His confusion over his identity, his bloodline, and his past ended up being a mystery I was happy to solve, and when he locked himself into the tower at the end, I did feel a little sad. I'm excited to potentially see more of him in the future, so here's hoping he keeps his word. Speaking of which, Crystal Tower fucking rules, dude. Full disclaimer, I've never played Final Fantasy III. I'd certainly like to at some point. I actually grew up playing NES games, so I have a higher tolerance for their quirks than most, and it seems to be relatively well received even to this day. For one reason or another, I've never gotten around to it. Nevertheless, that does mean that Naoki Yoshida's love letter to the influential JRPG classic is somewhat lost on me. What isn't lost, however, is just how grand the whole thing feels. It's a bit bewildering to me that these were originally optional side quests, because this is some of the most fun I've had with the game's dungeons in a long time, and the production value is off the charts. The boss fights require a lot out of you, forcing cooperation and every player to perform at their absolute best. This is the first time in a while that I had felt truly tested as a player, and it even made me a little insecure about my abilities for a while. Don't worry, that's meant to be a compliment. The returning bosses from Final Fantasy III look unbelievably badass, Xande especially, looking straight out of Asura's Wrath with his fiery hair and glowing muscular lines conveying raw, malicious power, and Thanatos, the Headless Warrior, reminded me of something out of Dark Souls. The quests also feature some of the patch quests, A Realm Reborn's coolest environments, from the noxious glowing green pits of the tower's base to the absolutely radiant tower peak, ending in the gothically nightmarish world of darkness. It's clear to me that Square wanted to go all out on these quests, and it certainly paid off. What initially felt like an unnecessary diversion ended up becoming my favorite section of the patch quests, and one that I'm somewhat glad became mandatory despite messing with the already questionable pacing. That's right, the pacing. This is one of those flaws that does carry over from the base game. Don't get me wrong, it's not nearly as egregious this time around. You don't exactly have the company of heroes breathing down your neck this time, something I'm very glad about. It manages to feel awkwardly paced in different ways. For example, the reuse of base game content. Throughout A Realm Reborn, there were plenty of side quests that would unlock more difficult versions of main scenario dungeons. These were nice optional challenges for players who wanted to test themselves while also making Duty Finder a little more interesting. The problem here is that in the patch quests, a similar concept is utilized, but instead they're mandatory parts of the main scenario. Don't get me wrong, I like Garuda, I like Titan, but I don't necessarily want to fight them again with little to no changes, at least outside of the Duty Finder. While there is an appropriate in-universe explanation as to why they've returned and why you have to repeat these fights, that doesn't make it feel less like padding. I understand that the patch quests are just that, free update quests to move the story along and set things up for the next expansion pack, and therefore it stands to reason that Square probably wouldn't put the same amount of money into them as they would, say, Heavensward. I'm not a game developer. I wasn't present during production. I don't know if maybe making new bosses, or at least new boss patterns, was potentially unfeasible for the team, but ultimately I can't say I appreciated it. Another thing that seemed to draw the pacing to a lull was the plotline with the Ivy, Eileen Roel. I think that's how you pronounce that name. I can't exactly put a finger on why. Her backstory is sympathetic, and you can follow her train of logic as to why she sold everyone out to numerous villainous parties. I can't help but feel it's just a fairly dull subplot that doesn't really go anywhere. I understand that the Ivy is just a massive red herring for Ilberd, and therefore being a distraction is seemingly very deliberate on the writer's part, but the execution is just off. Perhaps it's the fact that plenty of other things are going on in the narrative at that point, things that are more interesting than the Ivy, and I would have liked to get to sooner. Now that the narrative is more investing, something like the Ivy subplot being sort of boring feels worse, because I know that right around the corner is something better. If I had to summarize it, although the scenario is much better this time around, it juggles too much at once and feels a little scatterbrained as a result. They're trying to set up for Heavensward and trying to cram in so much at once that I don't think it flows as fluidly as it could. They certainly got the story down, but not quite the pacing, and that was probably the biggest black eye on the patch quests overall. While I can't touch upon every single side quest the game offers, I did go out of my way to play some particularly noteworthy ones: the Binding Coil of Bahamut and the Hildebrand quests. Binding Coil is a bit difficult to describe. Frankly, I can't give a comprehensive opinion on it. Every time I tried to queue up for a party, I'd sit there waiting for nearly an hour before giving up. Evidently, these quests are so difficult that people rarely want to play them to begin with. Determined to at least cover the narrative aspect of the quest, a far more experienced friend suggested that we remove the level cap and blaze through Binding Coil like the scumfuck cheaters we are. Because of this, I don't think I have any right to give any opinion on the dungeon or the boss design at all, as I didn't experience them as originally intended, so don't consider this an evaluation of the gestalt of Binding Coil, rather just the narrative. Though Binding Coil might have a high barrier to entry, it's well worth trying to get through due to how it bridges the gap between the original Final Fantasy XIV storyline and A Realm Reborn. Full transparency, I was still in elementary school when 1.0 was live, so I was never able to experience it, but even going in with merely the context A Realm Reborn gives you, it was easy to follow nonetheless. Master Louis Soir is built up throughout both the base game and the patch quests as an almost religious figure, with those who knew him celebrating his life and accomplishments. For young Alize and Alphinaud, Louis Soir is the mold to which they desire to shape their lives. The quests follow Alize, for the most part has been otherwise absent from A Realm Reborn, and her journey to discover what exactly happened to her grandfather after discovering traces of him while studying ancient Allagan artifacts. Descending further and further into the Allagan ruins is often visually breathtaking, and peeling back the different layers of the plot is decently investing. While I did see the plot twist of Louis Soir having become sworn to Bahamut coming a bit before it happened, I certainly didn't expect him to have become a primal. Bringing back the primary antagonist of 1.0 in a distorted form wrought potentially from their own memories, and turning the once proud Garlean general into a frothing, fanatical Frankenstein's monster of a person is an interesting way of bridging the gap between the two games. I much appreciated the additional development for Alize, as she's been largely absent from the game, and the red and blue Oni dynamic between how she and Alphinaud handle their indoctrinated grandfather characterizes them well, highlighting their similarities and differences. Unfortunately, I can't really go into the gestalt of Binding Coil, but I did enjoy the additional character development it brought, the spotlight on Alize, and the bridging of the gap between the two versions of Final Fantasy XIV. Despite having played them at that point, I didn't get around to talking about the Hildebrand questlines in the last video. I sort of regret it, as these questlines have very quickly become some of my favorites. Following the adventures of Agent of Inquiry, Inspector Extraordinaire Hildebrand Manderville, and his faithful assistant Nashu Makaraka, these side quests differ from the main scenario greatly, focusing on slapstick comedy rather than dramatic storytelling or intricate world building. These quests are consistently funny and often downright hilarious, fully embracing the world setting's capacity for silliness. Hildy and Nashu are a great pair, playing off of each other well, and the writers use their individual quirks to set up some great gags. There's a part in the questline where Hildebrand, on the trail of the Phantom Thief, in his self-important hubris, instructs Nashu to take detailed notes. Nashu, in her typical absent-mindedness, is slow to the draw with her pen, and only takes notes in the most suspiciously self-incriminating way possible. Inspector Briardian plays the straight man of the group, with his self-serious demeanor being instrumental in playing off the duo's ridiculousness, though some of Hildebrand's character traits are reflected in Briardian as well, such as his inflated sense of self-importance and frustration with his yin-yang counterpart. These characters ultimately might just be for gags, but the characterization both as individuals and as a group allows for the humor to shine. Part of why these quests are so funny is because the writers understood that with the right group of characters to play off of one another, funny scenarios will just naturally emerge. For example, Nashu, stricken with grief at the alleged death of Hildebrand, takes up building explosives as a strange way of coping. This unique character quirk ends up becoming important later, when her misplaced bombs nearly end up killing Briardian. There's a great mixture of genres here as well. Naturally, due to the occupations of the characters, they're primarily detective tales, though it mixes in elements of shonen anime, apocalypse films, and even government conspiracy. For longtime Final Fantasy fans, there's plenty of mythology gags to appreciate here as well, such as fan-favorite samurai Gilgamesh showing up for multiple boss fights. Square isn't afraid to get downright goofy, providing what are easily some of the most memorable sequences in all of Final Fantasy XIV. It's also funny how these slapstick comedy cutscenes are generally far better directed than main scenario cutscenes, with more dynamic and creative cinematography, expressive editing, and stylish closing sequences. Compared to the often dull high-angle wide shots and awkward blocking that pepper the main questline, these feel like a breath of fresh air. They even often test the limits of the engine's animation systems, which does get a little funny when you eventually see the same techniques pushed in the main scenario, though played completely seriously. I guess if I had to draw some straws as far as complaints go, sometimes the quests overuse juvenile sound effects a little more than I'd like, though this is definitely just me being extremely nitpicky, and even so was never even close to being a massive problem. If you told me a year ago that some of Final Fantasy XIV's most consistently great content was a series of comedy side quests, I wouldn't have believed you. But in my experience, the Hildebrand questlines are some of my favorites in the entire game. I cannot recommend them enough. Masayoshi Soken made a name for himself among Final Fantasy fans when he replaced longtime series composer Nobuo Uematsu when it came to scoring A Realm Reborn. If you watched my first video, you might remember that Soken's score for A Realm Reborn was one of the game's shining jewels, which I found very little, if any, fault in. While I do think Uematsu probably got more experimental with 1.0's soundtrack than Soken ever did for A Realm Reborn, I think Soken's work is not only more fitting for what Final Fantasy XIV had become under Yoshida's direction, but also more consistent in quality. While I never played 1.0, listening to the Before Meteor album makes it clear that Uematsu's work is still very, very good, and there are a lot of energetic and ambient bangers here nonetheless, but it often feels somewhat aimless, and I wouldn't rank it among my favorites of his work. A Realm Reborn soundtrack in most ways utterly eclipses it, at least for me, and it is one of the first things I think of when I picture Final Fantasy XIV in my head. It's since become them what I highly regard as one of the best video game soundtracks out there, so naturally, part of my motivation for playing more of this game is hearing more of Soken's work. Unsurprisingly, he did return to score the patch quests, and he does a very solid job at it too. The highlights here are easily the boss fight themes, which deviate greatly from the rest of the game's orchestral musical tone. Following in the footsteps of the base game's Under the Weight, these boss themes primarily take on a decidedly alternative rock tone, with defiant vocals and shredding electric guitars, as well as a greater focus on lyricism provided by Michael Christopher Koji Fox. Oblivion was easily my favorite track in the entire questline, with satisfying chord progression, catchy guitar riffs, and Ayumi Murata's punkish vocals causing it to become my morning commute song of choice. Through the Maelstrom took some warming up to, as I initially found Soken's vocals fairly sloppy, but over time I've come to appreciate the impressive bass work in particular, though I still consider the female vocals version on the album the definitive version of the song. Thunder Rolls practically sweeps into Ramuh's boss arena, with atmospheric orchestrations, transcendent vocals, and easily the best lyricism in the questline, giving it an ethereal, unearthly feeling. I really appreciated how the opening verse was in a fictional language with a meaning that can actually be translated. That was really cool. As for the rest of the questline soundtrack, I did generally enjoy what I heard in-game, and I've listened to the album release back-to-back at least once, though it did strike me as a little less memorable than the base game soundtrack. For example, all of the frontline themes are fairly dull and unmemorable, at least to me. There's still some absolutely fantastic work here nonetheless. Soken has a great ear for orchestral compositions that make the experience feel suitably grand. The soprano on Out of the Labyrinth conveys the otherworldly atmosphere of the Crystal Tower incredibly well. The beautifully forceful orchestrations on Shattered push the player right into the actions, and the aggressive percussion and brass on Faith in Her Fury convey the intensity and urgency of the Siege of the Steps of Faith, with a distant flute providing a sliver of hope against the overwhelming onslaught of the Dravanians. Needless to say, even if Soken doesn't always bring his A-game here, that's not to say it's absent. Quite the opposite, in fact. I also appreciate the return of many of Uematsu's 1.0 tracks, specifically within the Binding Coil questline. I was always going to appreciate these tracks cropping up at some point, but it feels especially relevant here, and when Rise of the White Raven plays during a certain boss fight, it's a powerful moment, doubly so for those who actually got to play 1.0 when the servers were up. On that note, fair warning for those who intend to listen to Before the Fall, the soundtrack album for the patch quests. While viewed in isolation, it's a very solid album. A good quarter of it are songs reused from Before Meteor, and if you're like me and already own a copy of Before Meteor, this does make Before the Fall a bit repetitive to get through at points. For most players, this won't be a problem, but if you're like me, I'd recommend just nabbing it at a heavy discount. I think $50 is a little much for that. This isn't a criticism of the game at all, but I think it's something that should be made clear nonetheless. Holistically, Soken's work for the patch quests is, as expected, very commendable. There's not exactly much to dislike, and for the most part, it's fairly in line with his past work. I definitely appreciate the greater emphasis on deviations from the orchestral formula. Just don't expect nearly as many standout tracks as there were in the base game. As any Final Fantasy XIV player will tell you, voice acting wasn't a Realm Reborn's strong suit, apparently being made quickly by a studio with little to no voice direction for the actors to spring off from due to extreme time constraints. It was stilted, awkward, and often unintentionally funny, but without the so bad it's good charm that something like, say, Resident Evil brought. The patch quests don't do any major recasting to my knowledge. As far as I can tell, all of the original English voice actors are here and accounted for. On paper, this spells disaster. I was fully prepared to be taken out of my immersion in the story due to poorly directed performances, as was the case with the base game. I suppose, then, that the patch quests are a testament to the difference that proper recording time and voice direction can make. The actors who were already solid in the base game continue to deliver dependable performances. For example, Gideon Emery, who is able to convey Yuri Yanger's differing emotions with tact, whether it be flustered at Moonbreeda's flirting or despair at her sacrifice.
I heard all, my lady. Knowingly did I deny my friend the comfort she craved. And now she hath gone to her rest, with doubt still in her heart. The realization hath set her free. she may now find the peace which hath for so long eluded her.
Even Amy Bolton, who I had considered the worst of the base game's bunch, gets room to stretch her legs here. Sure, she's still not great by any means, but she comes off as significantly more natural than she did beforehand, and it shows that a bad performance can become a competent one with the right direction.
This device is a legacy of Moonbreeder's toils and sacrifice. I shall hold on to it for safekeeping.
Minfilia, are you all right?
I am.
The only one I didn't connect with at all was Alan Corduner as Midgard Sommer, whose long, drawn-out drawls harken back to some of the base game's awkwardness.
Speak, mortal, and I shall listen. Guided by a star. My people have heard the song. Ishgard shall burn.
Through and through, though, the performances are improved across the board, and while Final Fantasy XIV at this point in time still isn't exactly filled with great performances, it's much easier to take seriously, and with the major recasts that Heavensward brings, I hope things only continue to get better. While I am very, very proud of my Realm Reborn video, it wasn't perfect, and there were a handful of things I got wrong. Firstly, in the world setting segment, I had said the world was reeling from the 5th Umbral Calamity. This is incorrect, as the calamity that kicked off the plot of A Realm Reborn was the 7th Umbral Calamity. I also had a habit of mispronouncing a lot of things, something that I'm willing to bet probably continues into this video too. Most notably, Yuri Angers, whom I had called Yuri Anger. I'm now going to read the funniest comment I got about that. Thank you for leaving it, I did get a good laugh out of that. Another thing that could have used some clarification were my comments about Final Fantasy XIV's engine, which I had described as a heavily modified version of the Crystal Tools engine. While I have no doubt that there are a lot of remnants of Crystal Tools buried within the modern engine, all reports from Yoshida himself show that the game runs on its own custom proprietary engine developed by the same engine team that produced the Luminous engine for Final Fantasy XV, created almost entirely from scratch. Yoshida describes it as entirely distinct from both Crystal Tools and Luminous in multiple interviews, so my bad, I should have done more research there. Finally, this last part isn't necessarily a correction, as the original statements weren't incorrect, but rather an update to address a certain section of that video. Previously, I mentioned that Final Fantasy XIV suffered from performance problems in key areas of the game, especially popular town hubs like Limsa Lamenza, where players tend to congregate. While I still stand by these being problems, at the time I had been using a Ryzen 5 3600 CPU, which, while solid, was growing more and more outdated by the day. Since then, I've upgraded to a Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, and even in these demanding choke areas, the game drops to a minimum of 80 FPS, which comparatively is much, much nicer. I don't think any MMO has ever solved the problem of hub world performance, so I don't really know how much of the blame falls on Square here, so I would suggest updating your LOD settings or upgrading your CPU entirely. Final Fantasy XIV appears to be the gift that keeps on giving, seeing many key aspects of the game greatly improved not in an expansion pack, but in a series of free update quests is honestly pretty crazy. While I don't think they represent a major improvement for the game as a whole, mostly providing more of the same in most categories, the writing has greatly improved, and with a game that's as narratively focused as 14, that is rather significant. Not only was I enamored with the game's world setting, but I was fairly invested in its scenario as well. Yoshida and his team have provided the narrative with fairly complicated scenarios filled with nuance and gray areas, as well as genuinely challenging world issues with real-life parallels. The heroes don't always succeed. Sometimes their pride gets the best of them. Sometimes we fail despite our best efforts. Sometimes those whom we support don't return the favor. Sometimes they can't. It's a fairly grim end, all things considered, but one I'm glad Square had the balls to go through with. The pre-existing characters' personalities are conveyed much better, and the newcomers are all solid additions, being moderately enjoyable at worst. A lot of the new content provided is great as well, with Crystal Tower being one of the best things to come out of the game as a whole up to this point. While I couldn't actually play Binding Coil properly, the ways it ties into the original game while fleshing out a mostly unseen side character is much appreciated. The patch's new Hildebrand quests improve upon what is already a hilarious questline, with its fun character dynamics and even a somewhat dramatic conclusion to the Phantom Thief plotline. Soken's original score is dependable as always, and the ways he experiments with boss themes in particular are memorable and admirable. I just wish he took a few more risks overall. Even the voice acting has improved, with even the worst actors from A Realm Reborn giving much better performances. The A Realm Reborn patch quests aren't perfect, however, with it still suffering from disruptive pacing problems that slow the game down with repetitive and unnecessary content such as reused boss fights. Even these don't take up nearly as much time as 2.0's padding did, so there's improvement even within its faults. Final Fantasy XIV, at this point in its content pipeline, still isn't necessarily what I'd call a great game, but it is a very, very, very solid game that continues to reward investment with improvement. I don't usually do decimals, as I find them mostly unnecessary, but in this case, I think the exception is warranted. I'd give this series of patch quests a 7.5 out of 10. I am beyond excited for Heavensward. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I'm sorry for the wait for Final Fantasy XIV related content, but I intend to make a wide variety of videos about different topics, and content blocks in Final Fantasy XIV take quite a long time to complete. The reception to my last video on I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream was wildly positive, so I intend to continue both my Final Fantasy XIV series as well as more research-heavy videos on topics I'm more knowledgeable about. As stated in my last video, the video I'll make while playing Heavensward will be on the original Mega Man. Thank you so much for your continued support.